On a gray Thursday morning in October, in a salvage yard on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, a woman in a cashmere coat watched a crane operator position a hydraulic crusher over a 1969 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow and said, to no one in particular, "Finally!" The car had been sitting in that yard for 4 years. It had arrived on a flatbed truck from an estate in Asheville following the death of its last registered owner, a retired railroad engineer named Harold Sutton who had driven it once a week for 31 years and maintained it, according to his mechanic, with a devotion that bordered on religious. It had arrived in running condition. It had deteriorated in the yard because nobody had claimed it, and the probate had gone wrong in the particular way probates went wrong when the family was complicated, and the attorney was slow, and the estate contained more sentiment than organization. Margaret Callow, CEO of Callow Realty Capital, had paid $2 million to acquire the salvage lot itself, not the car, the entire lot, 12 acres of compressed metal and industrial land in a corridor she had been assembling for 3 years for a mixed-use redevelopment project. The Rolls-Royce was an obstacle in a transaction she had spent 11 months engineering. The crusher was the efficient solution. The man standing 15 feet behind her was named Owen Garrett. He was 37 years old. He was a mechanic from Mooresville who had driven 40 minutes that morning on a tip from a friend who worked the salvage yard's intake desk. He had a 6-year-old son named Caleb at home with a babysitter. He had $4,200 in his checking account. He had in the inside pocket of his flannel shirt a folded index card on which he had written 3 sentences the night before after reading everything he could find on the internet about the 1969 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. He watched the crane position the crusher arm. He said, "Ma'am, that car isn't dead." Margaret Callow turned around. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find in their peripheral vision. Not hostile. Assessing. She said, "3 certified mechanics have told me it's not restorable. The frame is compromised. The engine hasn't run in 4 years. Owen said, "I'd like to look at it before the crane does." A pause that lasted 4 seconds, which is a long time when a crane operator is being paid by the hour. She said, "You have 10 minutes. 22 minutes later, Owen Garrett had not finished looking at the car. He had also not said anything to Margaret Callow, who was standing with her arms folded and her patience at roughly the same level as the October temperature, which was 41 degrees. Her assistant had twice offered her a travel mug of coffee from the Range Rover. She had declined both times. She was watching Owen the way she watched people who were taking longer than allocated. At the 22-minute mark, Owen stood up from where he had been crouched beside the passenger side rocker panel. He turned around. He said, "The frame isn't compromised. The rust is surface oxidation over intact metal. The mechanics who told you otherwise either didn't get underneath it or didn't know what they were looking at." He paused. "The engine will run. It needs a fuel pump, a set of SU carburetors. You can get them from Berlin Fuel Systems in England, and someone who knows the difference between dead and dormant." Margaret Callow looked at him for a moment. She said, "What do you want for it?" He said, "Whatever you were going to pay the crane operator." She said, "That's $250. He said, "I'll give you $300. The crane operator was sent home. The Silver Shadow was loaded on Owen's borrowed trailer. And that night, in a rented garage bay on Industrial Drive in Mooresville, with his son Caleb asleep in a camp chair in the corner wrapped in a sleeping bag he'd brought from home, Owen Garrett started the engine of a car that $2 million and 3 professional opinions had written off as dead. It started on the 3rd crank. He drove it home at 11:15 that night through the empty streets of Mooresville, with the heater working and the leather seats cold, and the particular sound of a 6.25-liter V8 that had been waiting 4 years for someone to understand what it was. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this travels. Stay until the end, because what happened next had nothing to do with the car and everything to do with what the car was hiding. ACT1. The man from Mooresville, Owen Garrett, had grown up understanding engines the way some children grew up understanding music or mathematics, not as a subject to be studied, but as a language that the world around him happened to be speaking. His father, Dennis Garrett, had run a small engine repair shop on the outskirts of Mooresville for 30 years, in a corrugated metal building beside the house where Owen and his younger sister Diane had grown up. And from the age of 6, Owen had spent his Saturday mornings in that building watching his father work, handing tools, asking questions that Dennis answered seriously because he believed that a child who asked seriously deserved a serious answer. Dennis Garrett had not been a wealthy man. He had been a precise one. He had a specific philosophy about mechanical work which he articulated rarely but lived completely, and which Owen had absorbed so thoroughly that by the time he was old enough to articulate it himself, he could not determine where his father's understanding ended and his own began. The philosophy was this: a machine that stops working has not died. It has told you something. Your job is to listen carefully enough to understand what it said. Owen had taken over the shop at 26 when Dennis's arthritis made the fine work impossible and his pride made delegation difficult, and they had arrived at an arrangement that suited both of them. Dennis came in on weekdays when his hands allowed, gave opinions on anything that interested him, and went home at noon. Owen ran the shop. He had expanded it modestly over 11 years, adding a second bay and a parts sourcing relationship with 3 classic vehicle suppliers in the UK that had developed from a single forum thread in 2017 into a working arrangement that he conducted entirely by email because phone calls across time zones were impractical, and email had the advantage of creating a record. He had married Sarah Kendrick in 2015. Caleb had been born in 2016. Sarah had died in 2018, on a Tuesday morning in February, in a hospital in Charlotte, from a pulmonary embolism that had announced itself without warning and moved faster than the medical team who fought it. She had been 34 years old. Caleb had been 19 months old. The years that followed were the years that Owen did not discuss in detail with people who had not been inside them. He managed because he had his father, who had moved into the house on Birchwood Lane for 8 months, and then moved out when Owen had stabilized enough that the additional presence was support rather than necessity. He managed because Caleb was the kind of child whose needs were immediate and specific and left limited space for the kind of grief that wanted to take up residence and stay. He managed because the shop required it, and the shop had been his father's before it was his, and maintaining it was a form of fidelity to something larger than his own situation. He managed in the way people managed, which was to say imperfectly and forward. By October of the year he found the Rolls-Royce, Caleb was 6 and in first grade and deeply interested in 2 things: dinosaurs and anything with an engine, the latter of which was both a professional convenience and a personal delight. Owen dropped him at school at 8 and picked him up at 3, and on the days the shop was not busy, Caleb sat in the second bay on a stool that had a special non-slip pad that Dennis had added when Caleb was 4, and handed his father tools with the focused seriousness of someone who understood the job. The tip about the Rolls-Royce came from Marcus Webb, who worked intake at the salvage yard and had called Owen twice before about vehicles that turned out to be worth the drive. Marcus had called on a Wednesday evening and said, "There's a 1969 Silver Shadow here that's been sitting 4 years, and the new owner is crushing it Thursday morning. I thought you should know." Owen had spent 4 hours on the internet that night after Caleb was asleep. He had read forum threads on the Rolls-Royce Owners Club UK site, the Silver Shadow Registry, and a specialized restoration blog maintained by a retired engineer in Hampshire named Jeffrey Marsh, who had been documenting his own 1969 Shadow restoration for 7 years, and whose technical photography was precise enough to serve as a diagnostic reference. He had read the common failure points. He had read what was restorable and what wasn't. He had made notes on the index card. He had not slept much. He had called his neighbor Janet Briggs at 7 the next morning and asked if she could watch Caleb for the day. Janet was 71, retired, the grandmother figure in Caleb's life that circumstances had not otherwise provided, and she had said yes with the easy competence of someone for whom this request was a familiar and welcome one. He had borrowed his father's trailer. He had driven to Charlotte. He had no plan for what would happen if the car was actually dead. He had the index card and his hands and 37 years of listening to what machines were saying when everyone else had stopped paying attention. ACT2. The woman with the crane, Margaret Callow, had built Callow Realty Capital over 19 years from a one-person advisory practice, operating out of a rented office in uptown Charlotte into a firm that managed a portfolio of commercial real estate assets across 6 states with a combined valuation that 3 industry publications had in the previous year placed above $3 billion. She was 51 years old. She had silver hair that she had stopped dyeing at 43. A decision she had made on a specific morning when she was late for a board meeting, and had thought, with unusual clarity, that she no longer had the time or the patience to maintain a fiction about her own appearance. She had grown up in Concord, North Carolina, the daughter of a textile mill supervisor and a school librarian. in circumstances that were solidly working class and financially careful in the way of families who understood that the margin between stability and difficulty was narrower than it appeared, and that the management of that margin was a daily practice rather than a periodic concern. She had received a scholarship to UNC Charlotte, worked 22 hours a week throughout her undergraduate years, graduated with a degree in finance, and spent 6 years at a commercial real estate firm in Charlotte, learning the industry from a man named Gerald Forsyth, who was demanding, precise, and entirely unsentimental about mediocre work, which was the kind of teacher she had needed and had been fortunate to find. She had started Callow Realty Capital at 32 with $17,000 of savings, 2 clients she had cultivated on her own time at Forsyth's firm, and a business plan that she had written in 6 weeks and revised 4 times. The plan had been accurate in its essential projections in ways that she attributed not to forecasting ability, but to the habit of conservatism. She had planned for things to take longer than expected, cost more than budgeted, and require more patience than seemed reasonable. And she had been right about all 3 in ways that the more optimistic versions of the plan would not have survived. She had been married once, to a structural engineer named Robert who was a genuinely good man, and with whom she had been fundamentally incompatible in the specific way of 2 people who were both complete by themselves, and had found, after 6 years, that completeness was not the same as complementarity. The divorce had been handled with the same businesslike care that both of them applied to everything, which was both a tribute to their mutual respect and a fair description of what the marriage had been missing. They remained cordial. He had remarried. She had not. She had a grown daughter named Simone, 24, who worked for a nonprofit in Atlanta, and who had her mother's pragmatism and her father's warmth in a combination that Margaret found deeply satisfying as a parent and occasionally humbling as a person. The Charlotte Corridor redevelopment project had been in planning for 3 years. It was the largest single project Callow Realty Capital had undertaken, a mixed-use development on 12 acres in a post-industrial corridor that the city's planning commission had been trying to activate for a decade without landing the right developer. Margaret had spent 8 months building the land position, acquiring 6 contiguous parcels through a combination of direct purchase, option agreements, and 1 probate transaction that had required a specialized attorney, significant patience, and a detailed understanding of the relevant North Carolina estate statutes. The salvage yard parcel had been the last piece. It had taken 11 months. The probate had been complicated by a dispute between 2 cousins over the estate of the yard's original owner, and by the fact that the estate's assets included not just the 12 acres of land, but the contents of the yard, which required a separate valuation process, and had resulted in a total acquisition price that was, as Margaret had told her CFO, substantially above what the land itself was worth in isolation, and entirely justified by what the assembled position made possible. She had scheduled the clearing of the yard for Thursday morning, heavy equipment, 3 days, systematic removal of everything down to bare ground. The Rolls-Royce had been identified in the inventory as Lot 73, a non-running vintage vehicle of negligible salvage value. The 3 mechanics she had sent to assess the yard's inventory had flagged it as unsalvageable. The crushing was the logical step. She had not anticipated the man in the flannel shirt. She had let him look at the car because the crane operator's hourly rate was $40, and 10 minutes of a man's curiosity was not worth the cost of the argument that stopping it would require. She had not expected him to find anything. The 3 mechanics she had hired were not careless people. When he stood up at the 22-minute mark and told her the frame was sound and the engine would run, she had looked at him with the expression she gave information that reconfigured a previous assessment. She was not a person who resisted reconfiguration. She had built a $3 billion business in part because she was willing to update her conclusions when the evidence required it, and the evidence in front of her was a man who had been underneath that car for 22 minutes and who spoke about what he had found with the specificity of someone who was not theorizing. She had let him take the car, not as an act of generosity, as a recognition that she had been wrong about what she was looking at, which was the kind of mistake she could correct at minimal cost, and that correcting it was better than confirming it with a $250 hydraulic press. She had driven back to Charlotte with her assistant and had gone directly to a 2-hour meeting about the project's financing structure, in which she had been fully present and attentive because that was how she moved through her days. But somewhere in the second hour of that meeting, when a number on a slide was being discussed that she had already processed, she found herself thinking about the man in the flannel shirt and the specific quality of his certainty when he said the engine would run. She filed the thought. She moved forward. She did not expect to hear from him again. ACT-3, the engine and the night the rented garage bay on Industrial Drive was 800 square feet of concrete floor and fluorescent lighting, accessible on a monthly basis through an arrangement with a body shop owner named Pete Galveston who had 3 bays he rented to independent mechanics when his own work didn't fill them. Owen had used it for overflow work twice before, and Pete had his number. He had called Pete from the road on the way back from Charlotte. He had arranged Caleb's pickup from school through Janet. He had stopped at the parts supplier on Williamson Road and spent $212 on an SU carburetor rebuild kit. The Berlin HS series, compatible with the Silver Shadow's twin-carb setup, a new fuel pump, a set of gaskets, and 3 quarts of Castrol GTX 20W50 classic motor oil, which was the correct specification for the Silver Shadow's 6.25-liter engine and was available at most auto parts stores, including the O'Reilly Auto Parts on the way to Industrial Drive where he stopped for 10 minutes while the car sat on the trailer in the parking lot. He had the car in the bay by 5:30. Caleb arrived at 6, delivered by Janet in her Subaru Forester, already in his pajamas because it was past dinner time and the arrangement had included dinner. Caleb assessed the Silver Shadow with the focused attention of a 6-year-old encountering something significant. He said, "Dad, that car is fancy." Owen said, "It is." Caleb said, "Is it ours?" Owen said, $300 says it is. Caleb looked at the car for another moment. He said, "Is it broken?" Owen said, "It's dormant." Caleb said, "What's dormant?" Owen crouched to his son's level. He said, "You know how some animals sleep through the whole winter and people who don't know think they're dead, but they're not. They're just waiting for the right conditions." Caleb thought about this. He said, "Like bears." Owen said, "Like this car." Caleb went to the camp chair. Owen went to work. The first hour was assessment. He went over everything he had looked at in the salvage yard more carefully, now with proper lighting, a creeper, and his full toolkit. The frame was exactly what he had told Margaret Callow it was, surface rust, fully intact underneath. The kind of rust that frightened people who didn't know the difference between corrosion that had eaten through metal and corrosion that had painted the surface of it. He ran his hands along the main rails, checked the outriggers, checked the sill sections. Sound, all of it sound. The body had issues, paint oxidation, a dent in the near-side rear quarter that was cosmetic, a rear bumper chrome that was lifting at one corner. The interior was worn but original. The leather on the driver's seat had cracked along the bolster. The headlining had a water stain near the rear window that suggested a seal issue at some point, now dried out. The walnut veneer on the dashboard had lifted at one edge. None of it structural, all of it repairable. The second hour was the engine. He pulled the SU carburetors. The Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow from this period used twin SU HIF-7 carburetors, the same basic design that appeared on dozens of British vehicles of the era, which meant the rebuild kit was available, and the procedure was documented across 100 forum threads and Jeffrey Marsh's restoration blog, which Owen had printed 3 relevant pages from the night before. Strip the carburetors, clean the bodies with carb cleaner spray, replace the needle valves and float bowl gaskets from the rebuild kit, set the float heights and reassembled. The fuel pump was next. The original AC Delco mechanical pump had seized. He removed it, installed the replacement, primed the new fuel line by cranking the engine briefly with the ignition disconnected until fuel showed at the carb inlet. He checked the points in the distributor, worn but functional, with INSP. He checked the timing with a basic timing light he kept in his kit. Set the ignition timing to the 12 degrees before top dead center that the Silver Shadow called for. He changed the oil. He checked the coolant. He topped the brake fluid reservoir with .4 fluid and pumped the pedal until it firmed up. He checked all 4 wheels for brake function. He checked the power steering fluid. He checked the automatic gearbox fluid level. Caleb had been asleep in the camp chair for 2 hours when Owen stood beside the driver's door at 10:45 and looked at the car in the yellow light of the bay. He got in. The leather was cold. The dials of the instrument panel were arranged in the particular formal symmetry of a Rolls-Royce of this period, the design of a car that had been built under the assumption that the person sitting in it deserved instruments they could read at a glance without drama. He turned the key. The first crank was a long one. The starter motor was tired. The engine turned over without catching. Second crank, the same, long, labored almost. Third crank. The engine caught on a single cylinder, coughed, found the second, found the third, and then with a sound that was less like starting and more like arriving, deliberate, measured, entirely sure of itself. The 6.25-liter V8 of a 1969 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow settled into an idol that was, Owen thought, one of the most civilized sounds he had ever heard in a garage. Caleb woke up. He sat in the camp chair with the sleeping bag around his shoulders and his eyes wide and said, "Dad, you did it." Owen sat in the driver's seat of a car that $2 million and 3 certified mechanics had decided was finished and listened to its engine run. He said, "It did it." He let the engine warm for 20 minutes. He checked for any smoke from the exhaust, none. He checked for oil leaks under pressure, none. The temperature gauge climbed to operating range and held steady. The oil pressure gauge read normal. The voltmeter showed charge. He loaded Caleb into the passenger seat with the sleeping bag still around him. He drove the Silver Shadow out of the bay on Industrial Drive at 11:15 and turned north toward Mooresville on a Thursday night in October with the heater working, the leather seats warming, and his 6-year-old son asleep beside him, and the roads empty in the way October nights were empty, and the particular quality of driving something back from wherever it had been that he had no word for but recognized completely. ACT-4, what the car was hiding. Harold Sutton had been born in 1941 in Wilkes County, North Carolina, the son of a tobacco farmer and the third of 5 children in a family that was, by the measure of its time and place, ordinary in every way except one. Harold's father, James Sutton, had a collection. Not an art collection, not a coin collection. A collection of original survey maps, filed patent claims, and handwritten correspondence related to the original land grants in western North Carolina from the period 1790 to 1820, which he had assembled over 30 years by attending estate sales, contacting county clerks' offices, and corresponding with a network of amateur historians and archivists scattered across the mountain counties. James Sutton had not been an educated man in the formal sense, but he had been deeply interested in one specific subject, the question of what had happened to the land along the Yadkin River headwaters in the decades following the Revolution, and he had pursued that interest with the focused, patient attention of someone who believed that the answer to the question existed, and that finding it was worth the time. Harold had grown up with that collection in the back bedroom of the house. He had not shared his father's specific passion for it, but he had absorbed the habit of attention that the collection represented. When James Sutton died in 1974, Harold, by then an established railroad engineer with Southern Railway, 33 years old, living in Asheville, had packed the collection into 12 archive boxes and stored it in the attic of his house, understanding without quite articulating it that the collection was something to be kept. He had bought the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow in 1985, not as a luxury purchase, but as the answer to a question he had asked himself on his 44th birthday. What was the one thing he wanted that he had never permitted himself? He had found the car through an ad in the Asheville Citizen-Times, owned by a retired executive who was moving to Florida and wanted it gone before the move. He had paid $11,000, which was a significant sum for Harold Sutton in 1985, but not an impossible one, and he had driven it every Sunday for the next 31 years. He had maintained it with the same seriousness he brought to everything, which meant he had records. A green 3-ring binder in the glove box that he had maintained from the day of purchase, with a carbon copy of every service performed, every part replaced, every repair made. Dates, mileages, shop names. 31 years of documented mechanical history in handwriting that was small and precise in the way of a man who had spent a career reading blueprints. Owen found the binder on the 3rd day after bringing the car home. He had been going through the interior thoroughly, removing the rear seat cushion to check the condition of the base structure underneath, and the binder had been in a compartment behind the driver's seat that was easy to miss if you were not removing the seat completely. He had sat in the driveway on a Saturday morning with Caleb beside him eating cereal from a bowl and read through it. A mechanic's binder from a car's owner was not, in itself, extraordinary. It was the kind of thing that increased a vehicle's value at auction because it documented provenance and maintenance. Owen noted it with professional satisfaction and set it aside. It was on the 4th day that he found the other thing. He had been cleaning the boot, the trunk, in American usage, and had removed the spare wheel and the tool roll to access the floor of the compartment, and had noticed that the felt lining of the boot floor was not lying flat at the rear. Not dramatically. A 1/4-inch lift at one corner, the kind of thing you would miss if you were not looking at it directly with the attention of someone who had been trained to notice when surfaces were not fully adhering. He had lifted the felt. Under it, taped to the metal floor with brown packing tape that had dried to brittleness, was a manila envelope. The tape released without resistance. He took the envelope out. It was sealed. On the front, in the same small, precise handwriting as the service binder, was written, "For whoever ends up with this car, please read carefully before anything else." Owen sat on the driveway with the envelope in his hands for a moment. Caleb appeared at his elbow. He looked at the envelope. He said, "What's that?" Owen said, "A message from the man who owned this car." Caleb said, "What does it say?" Owen said, "I haven't opened it yet." Caleb said, "Open it, Dad." He did. ACT 5, James Sutton's question. The envelope contained 4 items: a handwritten letter, 6 pages long on legal pad paper, a smaller sealed envelope with a handwritten note that said "Open second," a hand-drawn map on graph paper, a business card for a man named Philip Arrowwood at the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh, with a handwritten note on the back that said, "Tell him it's about the Sutton collection. He's been waiting." Owen read the letter at the kitchen table that afternoon while Caleb watched television in the next room. Harold Sutton had written it in the summer of his last year, with the awareness, stated plainly in the letter's opening paragraph, that he was not going to be able to complete what his father had started. He had been diagnosed with the condition that was ending him. He had no children. His brother's 2 sons had no interest in the collection and had made clear that after his death the estate would be disposed of efficiently. He had been told by his attorney that the collection of maps and documents in his attic would most likely be sold at a state auction as a lot, meaning dispersed to whoever bid on it, meaning scattered. He had been troubled by this for years. He had tried 3 times to donate the collection to a historical institution. The North Carolina State Archives had expressed interest, but could not commit the resources to do the processing work that the collection required before it could be accessioned. The Wilkes County Historical Society had looked at it and decided it was outside their scope. A history professor at Appalachian State University had been enthusiastic and then changed positions, and the correspondence had died. Harold Sutton had understood by the final year of his life that institutions moved slowly and that the window was closing. He had decided on an alternative approach. He had put a letter in the car. The letter explained his father's collection in full. It explained what James Sutton had spent 30 years assembling and why it mattered. It explained the specific question, the question of the Yadkin River headwater land grants, and why the documents in the collection were, in Harold's understanding, the most complete surviving record of that period's land history in the region. It explained that 3 of the documents in the collection were, based on Harold's own research and the opinion of a retired Appalachian State professor named Walter Briggs who had died in 2011, potentially the only surviving copies of certain original grant instruments that had been thought lost when the Wilkes County Courthouse burned in 1863. If those documents were what Harold believed them to be, they were not merely historically interesting. They were legally significant, potentially relevant to land title disputes in the headwater region that had never been fully resolved because the original instrument record had been considered destroyed. The letter asked one thing of whoever found it. Philip Arrowwood at the State Archives had been told the collection existed and had agreed to receive it and process it properly if it arrived through a private donation with clear chain of custody. Harold had been unable to arrange that chain of custody himself because his brother's sons controlled the estate. He needed someone who had the car to go to the attic of the house in Asheville and get the 12 archive boxes before the estate was cleared. The house was still in the estate, not yet sold. The probate had been slow, which Harold had expected and counted on. There was still time. The key to the back door was in the smaller sealed envelope. The address was at the top of the letter. The second sealed envelope contained the key, a standard house key, brass, with a paper tag that said back door in the same small, precise handwriting. Owen sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He was a mechanic from Mooresville. He had $4,200 in his checking account and a 6-year-old son and a shop to run. He had driven to Charlotte on a tip about a car, spent $300, and brought home a 1969 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow that he had been thinking about in terms of restoration work and the value that restoration would represent. He was now holding a key to a dead man's house and a request that was entirely reasonable and entirely impractical and directed specifically at him because he was the person who had found the car when $2 million and a hydraulic crusher had almost made sure no one would. He thought about his father, who had spent 30 years in a corrugated metal building listening to what machines were trying to say. He thought, the machine is still talking. You have to listen to the whole thing. He called Philip Arrowwood at the State Archives the next morning. ACT 6. Philip Arrowood. Philip Arrowood had worked at the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh for 27 years. He was 56 years old, meticulous in the way of archivists who understood that their job was not to find things, but to ensure that things could be found. And he had a specific professional interest in the history of land tenure in western North Carolina that his colleagues regarded with the affectionate tolerance extended to a person's consuming passion when it is clearly genuine and occasionally useful. Harold Sutton had contacted him 4 years before his death through a letter sent to the Archives Acquisitions Department. Philip had responded. They had corresponded 3 times. Harold had described the collection with enough specificity that Philip had been able to form a clear picture of what it contained. And what he had seen in that picture had made him careful in his response and patient in the follow-up. Because the collection, as Harold described it, contained something that the archives had been aware of as a gap for decades. The original Yadkin River headwater land grant instruments from the period 1790 to 1820 were a known absence in the state's historical record. The courthouse fire of 1863 had destroyed the Wilkes County recorded copies, and the colonial and early federal period had not produced the kind of redundant documentation that later bureaucratic systems generated. Historians of North Carolina land tenure had worked around the gap for 150 years. It was the kind of absence that became normalized. You built the analysis around what you had and noted the gap in the footnotes. The possibility that original grant instruments had survived in private hands, in a back bedroom archive box assembled by a tobacco farmer who had been too interested in one thing to know when to stop, was exactly the kind of thing that archivists spent careers hoping for and rarely found. When Harold had died and the correspondence had gone silent, Philip had sent 2 follow-up letters to the estate address, both of which went unanswered because the estate was in probate and nobody was receiving Harold Sutton's mail. He had filed a note in the acquisition system and moved forward, because that was what you did with things you couldn't control, and he had not stopped thinking about it. When Owen called on a Monday morning and said, "My name is Owen Garrett, I'm a mechanic in Mooresville, and Harold Sutton left me a key to his house," Philip Arrowood sat down at his desk and was quiet for 4 seconds. He said, "Tell me exactly what you found." Owen told him. The letter, the key, the graph paper map, the business card. He read Philip the relevant passage from the letter about the 3 documents. He described the collection as Harold had described it in the letter. Philip said, "Mr. Garrett, is the estate still in probate?" Owen said, "I don't know, I'm a mechanic, I don't know how to check that." Philip said, "I do, give me your number, I'll call you back in an hour." He called back in 50 minutes. The estate was still in probate. The Asheville property had not been sold. There was a 2-month window before the next scheduled court date that would likely result in an order for property liquidation. He said, "The key Harold left you is a private key to his property. Using it before we have legal authorization could create complications. I need to involve the estate attorney and the probate court. That takes time." Owen said, "How much time?" Philip said, "Normally weeks. In a case where the estate has no formal provisions for a specific bequest, and Harold's letter to you is not a formal bequest, it's a request, we need to move through the estate administration." Owen said, "What happens to the collection if the court orders liquidation before you get there?" Philip was quiet for a moment. He said, "It gets sold at a state auction, probably as a bulk lot of old paper, probably to someone who doesn't know what they have, probably dispersed." Owen said, "What if I found a way to make this move faster?" Philip said, "What do you have in mind?" Owen said, "I know someone with more resources than I have." He was looking at the Rolls-Royce through the kitchen window when he said it. He was not sure yet whether that someone would take his call. He was fairly sure she would. ACT 7, the call he found Margaret Callow's direct number through the Callow Realty Capital website, which listed a general inquiry address and a main office line. He called the main line, asked for Ms. Callow's assistant, was transferred, explained that his name was Owen Garrett and that he was the mechanic from the salvage yard on Thursday and was asked to hold. The hold lasted 3 minutes, which he had expected to be longer. Margaret's voice came on and said, "The car runs." It was not a question. He said, "Third crank." She said, "What does it need for a full restoration?" He said, "We can discuss the car. I'm calling about something else." A pause. She said, "Go ahead." He explained it from the beginning. The binder, the envelope, Harold Sutton, James Sutton, the collection, Philip Arrowood, the probate window. He was specific about each part because he had spent the previous hour organizing the information in the sequence that would make it clear, which was a habit he had developed because the people he worked with professionally needed to understand what he had found before they could make decisions about it. Margaret Cal listened without interrupting. He registered this. Most people interrupted. When he finished, she said, "You're asking me to retain a probate attorney to accelerate the estate administration so the collection can be donated to the state archives." He said, "I'm asking if you would. I don't have the resources to retain a probate attorney on the timeline this needs. Philip Arrowwood does public sector work. He can navigate the archives end. The bottleneck is the estate." She said, "What's your interest in this?" He said Harold Sutton put a letter in that car because he believed whoever found it would do something with it. "I found it because $2 million almost turned the car into a compressed metal cube. I think that obligates me to at least make the call." A pause that was longer than the previous ones. She said, "I'll call my attorney." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Tell me about the restoration." He said, "What do you want to know?" She said, "What does it need, all of it?" "Starting with the body," he told her. The full list methodically in the order of priority. Body and paint, cut and polish the existing lacquer where it was sound, strip and respray where it wasn't. The standard paint code for this car was shell gray with a darker gray coach line, but he would pull the original code from the commission number stamped on the firewall and source the correct glycerit paint match. The near-side rear quarter dent could be pulled and filled. The chrome would need professional rechroming, ideally through HB Plating in Birmingham, UK, which did period-correct Rolls-Royce chrome work. Interior, the leather was Connolly Hide Original, which was no longer made but could be matched by Bridge of Weir leather in Scotland if they were sourcing it properly. The headlining was a standard Rolls-Royce West of England cloth that was available through RR specialists. Mechanically, the engine was now running, but would need a full service once it had settled back into regular operation. New belts, hoses, thermostat. The brakes would need new pads all round, and the rear calipers were suspect. The gearbox was the ZF4 HP22 automatic and seemed functional, but he wouldn't know until it had been driven properly. The hydraulic system that operated the windows and the central locking would need full inspection and likely a new pump. These systems were the Silver Shadow's known weakness, driven by a belt off the engine and sensitive to fluid degradation. He said, "All in, done properly, you're looking at around $45,000 in parts and labor at current supplier prices. More if you use Rolls-Royce specialists for the bespoke items. Less if you use good independent shops who know the car." Said, "What's it worth restored?" He said, "A documented 1969 Silver Shadow in excellent condition with full service history, which this car has because Harold kept 31 years of records, is selling at specialist auction between $80,000 and $120,000 currently. More if it attracts the right buyer on the right day." She said, "That's interesting math." He said, "The math is why I drove to Charlotte on a tip." She said, "You paid $300. He said, "You paid $2 million for the yard." She said, "I did." A pause. "I was going to crush it." He said, "I know." She said, "I was wrong about it." He said, "You updated when the evidence changed. That's not wrong." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'll have a name for you by Thursday." ACT8, the collection Margaret's attorney was a woman named Frances Odom who specialized in estate and probate law from a firm in Charlotte, and who had been handling Margaret's estate-related legal work for 6 years. Frances was the kind of attorney who did not explain why things were going to be slow. She explained what she was going to do to make them faster, and then she did it. She contacted the estate attorney in Asheville, a man named Berkowitz who had been moving at the pace of a man who had not yet been presented with a reason to move faster. She presented a petition for an emergency protective order covering the archival materials in the Sutton estate property, on the grounds that the materials were potentially of significant public historical value and were at risk of dispersal or damage pending probate resolution. She attached a supporting declaration from Philip Arrowwood at the State Archives, documenting the archive's interest in the collection and its potential historical significance. The petition was filed on a Wednesday. The hearing was scheduled for Friday. The judge, a woman named Caldwell in Buncombe County, had read the Arrowwood declaration and asked one clarifying question about the scope of the protective order, and then granted it. Owen drove to Asheville on the following Monday with Philip Arrowwood, who had driven up from Raleigh in a state vehicle with 12 archival boxes of his own and the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for this for 4 years. The key worked. The attic was exactly as Harold's letter had described it. 12 archive boxes in a row along the north wall, numbered in Harold's handwriting 1 through 12, each sealed with brown packing tape, each labeled on the end with a date range, and a brief description that corresponded to the contents James Sutton had organized by decade and county. Philip opened box 4 first. because Harold's letter had specified that the 3 potentially significant documents were in Box 4. He lifted the lid with the careful hands of someone who had been doing this for 27 years and understood that the moment of opening was irreversible and therefore deserved full attention. He looked at the first document for a long time without speaking. Owen was standing at the attic window, looking at the view of the Asheville Hills through the October trees. He heard the silence and turned around. Philip said without looking up, "Mr. Garrett, do you know what a land patent grant instrument looks like from the early federal period?" Owen said, "No." Philip said, "It looks like this." He held it up, with the state seal of North Carolina and the signature of the governor and a date of 1797. He was quiet for another moment. "This is the Yadkin River Headwater Grant for the Upper Roaring River Tract. This document has not been in any archive in the state of North Carolina. It has not existed in any record I have been aware of for 160 years. Owen looked at the document in Philip's hands. He said, "Is that the one Harold thought was significant?" Philip said, "This is the first one." He set it down carefully and lifted the folder beneath it. He opened it. He said, "This is the second one." They carried all 12 boxes to Philip's state vehicle that afternoon. Philip signed a detailed receipt that Francis Odom's office had prepared, documenting each box and its contents as a provisional donation pending full probate clearance, which Francis had arranged as a condition of the protective order. The estate would receive the donation credit in the probate accounting, which had the practical effect of giving Harold Sutton's estate a documented bequest to a state institution rather than a bulk auction sale, which the probate judge had found satisfactory. Owen drove back to Mooresville in the afternoon. The sky was the particular clear blue of an October afternoon in the North Carolina mountains, the kind of day that didn't announce itself as significant while it was happening. He picked Caleb up from school. Caleb had lost a tooth at lunch and was performing the gap for anyone who would look at it, which was everyone because a missing tooth at 6 was headline news. Owen looked at it and said it was excellent. Caleb said, "Dad, did you get the stuff from the house?" Owen said, "We got it." Caleb said, "Was it important?" Owen said, "Yeah, it was pretty important." Caleb nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. He had told Owen the night before, while Owen was explaining the plan, that he thought it was the right thing to do because Harold had put the letter in the car because he needed help and they had found the car, so they were the ones who were supposed to help. Owen had said that was correct. Caleb had said, "Then you should go." Owen had thought that his son made things very clear. ACT 9, the restoration. Owen began the formal restoration of the Silver Shadow in November. He worked on it in the evenings after the shop closed and on weekend mornings before Caleb woke, which gave him 4 to 5 hours a week that were not enough for speed but were enough for progress, which was what he had. He ordered the Connolly-matched leather from Bridge of Weir Leather in Scotland. The specific grade was Bridge of Weir corrected car leather in the period correct cream, matched to the sample he had carefully cut from the inside of the door card, where the color was least faded. The headlining cloth he sourced from Wilton Carpets in the UK, which still wove to the original Rolls-Royce specification. The chrome work he sent to a shop in Greensboro that did quality restoration chrome and had done Rolls-Royce pieces before. The paint he matched himself. The commission number on the firewall decoded to shell gray over Seychelles gray, a two-tone combination that had been a popular factory option in 1969, with the main body in the lighter shell gray and the coach line and lower sill in the deeper Seychelles gray. He sourced the Glasserit paint codes from a Rolls-Royce forum thread and had them mixed at a professional automotive paint supplier in Charlotte. The hydraulic system, as he had predicted, needed a full rebuild. He ordered a new Rolls-Royce hydraulic pump, the SUHBX unit that these cars used, from P&A Wood Rolls-Royce and Bentley specialists in Great Easton, Essex, along with the hydraulic fluid, which was a specific mineral-based fluid and not a standard DOT specification, and which using the wrong version of would destroy the pump seals. He noted this in the shop records with the kind of specificity that saved the next mechanic the hour of research it had taken him. He documented everything, not for any external purpose, because documentation was what his father had taught him, because the service binder Harold Sutton had kept for 31 years was the thing that made this car historically coherent and commercially significant, and continuing that record was the correct response to having inherited it. Margaret called on a Tuesday evening in December. He was in the garage reworking the rear brake caliper. He answered on speaker. She said, "Philip Arrowwood called me." Owen said, "About the documents." She said, "About the 3 original grant instruments. He says the archives has had them examined by 2 independent historians and a forensic document examiner. They're authentic." A pause. He said the word unprecedented. He doesn't use words casually. Owen set down the caliper tool. He leaned against the bench. He said, Harold knew. She said, his father spent 30 years collecting for a reason. Owen said, the car was what made the difference. If the car had been crushed, nobody would have found the letter. The estate would have gone to auction, the boxes would have been sold as a bulk lot, the documents would have ended up in a collector's storage who may or may not have known what they had. She said, Harold put a letter in a car he expected to survive. Owen said, he had maintained it for 31 years. He had every reason to think it would survive him. She said he didn't expect his estate to go into 4 years of probate. Owen said, no. A pause. She said, how's the restoration going? He said, slowly, I'm doing it evenings and weekends. The body work is done. The chrome is at the shop in Greensboro. The leather is coming from Scotland in February. She said, Scotland. He said, Bridge of Weir, original spec. It's the right material for the car. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I'd like to see it when it's done. He said, that's a few months away. She said, I'm not in a hurry. He said, I know, I'll let you know when it's ready. She said, Owen. It was the first time she had used his first name. He said, yeah. She said, I've been thinking about the salvage yard, about the 3 mechanics I sent. He said, they weren't wrong from where they were standing. She said, they were wrong. He said, they were looking at a surface. The surface was genuinely bad. They just didn't get underneath. She said, that's more charitable than the situation requires. He said, it's what happened. I don't see why to make it more than what it was. She said, that's a useful quality. He said, my father says the same thing. She said, your father sounds like someone worth listening to. Owen looked at the silver shadow in the garage bay, the body panels gleaming under the shop light in their fresh shell gray, the engine bay clean and correctly assembled for the first time in years. He said, he is. ACT-10, CALEB and the car, the leather arrived from Bridge of Weir on a Thursday in February, in 2 flat boxes wrapped in tissue paper that Owen opened on the workbench with the careful attention that good material deserved. The hide was exactly right. The cream color matching the sample he had sent with the precision of people who had been matching period automotive leather for decades. He ran his hand across the surface. It had the grain and weight of the original Connolly. Not identical, because Connolly had stopped producing automotive leather in 2002 and no substitute was fully identical, but close enough that someone who knew what they were looking for would have to look very closely. Caleb was 7 in February. He had become, over the 4 months since the silver shadow had arrived in the garage, deeply invested in its progress. He had a specific spot on the workbench stool where he sat when Owen was working on it, and he tracked the progression with the focused attention of someone monitoring a long-term project. He knew the car's name. He called it the Silver, because 6- and then 7-year-olds applied naming systems that were their own, and he knew its history in the simplified version Owen had given him, which included Harold and James and the attic boxes and the archives, because Owen believed in explaining things fully even when the full explanation was long. He had asked in January whether the Silver was going to stay. Owen had said he wasn't sure yet. Caleb had said, I think it should. Owen had said, that's something to consider. Caleb had said, Harold wanted someone to take care of it. We're taking care of it. That's the whole thing. Owen had looked at his son for a moment and thought that 7-year-olds occasionally made things extremely clear. The chrome came back from Greensboro in February as well, and it was good work. The bumpers and the grille surround and the door handles and the window surrounds all rechromed to a depth and clarity that changed the character of the car's appearance. Owen fitted them on a Saturday afternoon while Caleb ate a granola bar on the stool and provided a running commentary on the improvements. By the end of February, the car was assembled. Owen had done a final mechanical check, full fluid levels, brake test, all electrical systems, the hydraulic pump tested through a full window cycle and lock cycle, and had driven it 40 miles on the back roads north of Mooresville, on roads that were empty enough to listen properly. And the car had performed with the steady, unhurried confidence of something that had been built for the long run and had simply been waiting to run. It was, he thought, the most satisfying mechanical project he had ever completed. Not because it was the most complex. He had done more technically demanding work on other cars, but because every step of it had been a conversation with a machine that wanted to be what it was, and he had listened carefully enough to let it. His father came to see it on a Sunday in early March. Dennis Garrett walked around it 3 times without speaking, in the way he had always walked around a finished piece of work, taking in the whole before he offered any part. He crouched beside the rocker panels, running his hands where Owen had run his hands in the salvage yard 4 months earlier. He looked at the engine. He sat briefly in the driver's seat. He got out. He said, the paint is right. Owen said, I matched from the commission number. Dennis said, the leather too. Owen said, Bridge of Weir. Dennis looked at his son. He said, "You know what this is worth." Owen said, "I know what the market says." Dennis said, "What does Owen say?" Owen didn't answer right away. He looked at the silver shadow in the morning light coming through the garage door, the shell gray catching it in the quiet way of a car that had never needed to announce itself. He said, "I think I need to drive it to Charlotte." Dennis nodded once. He understood the sentence completely. ACT 11, Charlotte, March. Owen called Margaret on a Tuesday morning. He said, "The car is done." She said, "Drive it down." He said, "Saturday morning." She said, "I'll be here." He left Mooresville at 9 on Saturday. Caleb was at his father's house for the morning. Dennis had been informed, had said nothing beyond "don't speed," which was his version of a send-off. The drive from Mooresville to Charlotte was 40 minutes on a clear March morning when the hills were beginning their first tentative color, and the light had the quality of a season that hadn't quite committed to itself yet. Owen drove it at the speed limit the entire way. Not because he was being careful about the car was ready to be driven, but because the drive itself deserved attention. He had the radio off. He listened to the engine. He listened to the gearbox. He listened to the way the car communicated through the wheel, and the seat in the way that cars of this period communicated directly, without the electronic mediation that modern vehicles interposed between the machine and the person driving it. He felt it as the letter had described it, not in those words. Harold Sutton had not written about driving the car in the letter, but in the fact that Harold had driven it once a week for 31 years and maintained it with a devotion that his mechanic had called religious. You didn't do that for a car you didn't feel something in. You did that for a car that felt worth the attention. He pulled into the Callow Realty Capital parking garage on Trade Street at 10:15. Margaret was there standing beside the entrance in a wool coat, not the cashmere one from the salvage yard. Something less formal. She watched him pull in. He got out. She walked to the car. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at it with the full attention she gave things that deserved it, which Owen had observed was a consistent quality in her, the ability to actually stop and look rather than glancing in the direction of a thing while attending to something else. She said, "It's beautiful." He said, "It's what it was supposed to be." She said, "Harold would recognize it." He said, "That was the intention." She walked around it. She ran her hand along the rear fender the way you touch something you want to be certain is real. She looked at the interior through the window. She said, "The leather." He said, "Scotland." She said, "Of course." A pause. "How much have you put into it, all in?" He said, $41,600 plus the 300. She said, "And the hours." He said, "The hours are my own." She looked at him. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" He said, "Caleb thinks we should keep it." She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think he's probably right." A pause. "He usually is." She said, "Harold drove it every Sunday." He said, "I know." She said, "That seems like the right protocol." He said, "It does." They stood in the parking garage with the silver shadow between them and the March light coming in at the low angle of a morning that was working out how warm it intended to get. The car sat the way it had sat in the salvage yard, with the particular stillness of something that had done what it was built to do and was prepared to keep doing it. Margaret said, "I've been thinking about the mechanics I sent." Owen said, "You said that in December." She said, "I'm still thinking about it. I send people to look at things and I use their assessment to make decisions. That's the system, but the system failed on this one because the people in it didn't have the specific knowledge they needed." He said, "Most people don't know what they're looking at with a car like this. It takes a specific kind of experience." She said, "It takes someone who listened to what their father taught them." He said, "Among other things." She looked at the car. She said, "I want to commission a restoration, a different car. I've been thinking about it since October." A pause. "There's a 1972 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow coupe in an estate in Virginia. It was the personal car of a significant figure. The provenance is fully documented. The estate is selling it and 3 appraisers have assessed it, and all 3 assessments have the same problem yours had." He said, "They didn't get underneath it." She said, "I'd like you to go look at it." He said, "I have a shop in Mooresville." She said, "I know. The commission would be on your terms, your timeline, your process." He said, "What are you looking for from it?" She said, "I want to understand what I almost crushed." She looked at him. "I want to understand what the mechanics didn't know." He looked at her steadily. He said, "That's a long education." She said, "I'm not in a hurry." He said, "You said that in December." She said, "I meant it in December." He said, "I'll go look at the Virginia car." She said, "Good." He said, "I'm going to drive home the long way." She looked at him. He gestured at the silver shadow. She said, "Take the road north through Concord. The hills are good this time of year." He said, "I know that road." She said, "I grew up on it." He looked at her for a moment. The information settled. He thought about 2 people who had grown up in the same general country, the North Carolina of careful families and honest work and the particular kind of attention that came from understanding that the margin was narrow, and had arrived at the same parking garage from directions they hadn't expected. He said, "I'll take the Concord Road." She said, "Drive carefully." He said, "Always." ACT 12. What Gets Kept. The North Carolina State Archives held a small recognition event in April for the donation of the Sutton collection. It was not a large event, a conference room on the second floor of the Archives building in Raleigh, 20 people, coffee and pastries from a local bakery, a brief statement from the state archivist about the historical significance of what had been received. Owen came with Caleb. Philip Arrowood had specifically asked him to come, and had asked specifically about whether Caleb was available, which Owen had thought was the question of a man who understood that the occasion was as much about the next generation as the present one. Margaret came from Charlotte. She had cleared her Thursday afternoon for it, and she had not told Owen she was coming until that morning, a text at 8 that said simply, "Raleigh at 2. Philip said it was okay to bring someone. He had replied, "Caleb's looking forward to it." She had replied, "So am I." The 3 original grant instruments were displayed in the conference room under glass, the documents that had not existed in any archive for 160 years. The handwriting of 1797 in iron gall ink on rag paper that had survived because a tobacco farmer in Wilkes County had known they were worth keeping, and a railroad engineer in Asheville had known the same thing, and a mechanic in Mooresville had listened to what a dead man had hidden in the boot of a car. Philip explained them to Caleb at the level a 7-year-old could understand, which was, "These papers tell us who owned the land when North Carolina was brand new. They've been lost for a long time, now they're found." Caleb looked at them under the glass for a long time. He said, "Harold's grandfather collected these." Philip said, "His father." Caleb said, "And Harold kept them in his attic." Philip said, "For 40 years. Caleb looked at the documents. He said, "He must have really thought they were important." Philip said, "He really thought they were important." Caleb said, "He was right." Philip looked at Owen. Owen looked at his son. Margaret, standing slightly to the side, watched this exchange with an expression that Owen had been learning to read over the 5 months since the salvage yard, and which meant she was thinking about something she was not yet ready to say. The state archivist made a brief speech. He used the word custodianship, which was the right word. The idea that certain things passed through hands in ways that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with responsibility. He thanked the Garrett family, which made Caleb stand slightly straighter in the way of a 7-year-old being publicly acknowledged. He thanked Margaret Callow, who nodded once with the brevity of a person who found public acknowledgement mildly uncomfortable and was managing it gracefully. Afterward, standing in the parking lot with the April afternoon beginning to warm, Caleb at his side eating a pastry that the event had supplied, Owen looked at Margaret. He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "I needed to see them under glass." He said, "The documents." She said, "All of it, the whole chain." A pause. "I paid $2 million for a piece of land and almost destroyed a car that had been waiting 40 years to complete something. That's a near miss I want to remember clearly." He said, "The car's fine." She said, "Because you drove 40 minutes on a tip." He said, "Because Harold kept 31 years of service records and James spent 30 years collecting. The chain started a long time before me." She said, "You're the one who got underneath it." He said, "That's what I do." She said, "I know." A pause. "I want to learn how." He looked at her. She was looking at the parking lot, the specific expression of someone thinking about something with full seriousness. He said, "It takes time." She said, "I know." He said, "You have to be willing to be wrong." She said, "I've been wrong once that I know of in the past 6 months." He said, "You update it immediately." She said, "That's the requirement." He said, "Yeah." A pause. "Then you'll learn." Caleb finished the pastry and said, "Dad, can we go see the car before we drive home?" Owen had parked the Silver Shadow in the Archives visitor lot 2 rows over. He had driven it from Mooresville that morning. Drove it to significant occasions, and he had decided sometime in March that this was the category of car that deserved to be present at the things that mattered rather than preserved from them. The 3 of them walked to the visitor lot. Caleb ran ahead and stood beside the car with his arms out in a gesture of presentation. He said, "This is the silver." Margaret said, "I know." Caleb said, "We're keeping it." Margaret said, "Good." Caleb said, "Do you want to sit in it?" Margaret looked at Owen. He nodded. She sat in the passenger seat. Caleb got in the back. Owen got in the driver's seat. He started it. The engine settled immediately into the idle that had been one of the most civilized sounds he had heard in a garage, and which was no less so in a parking lot in Raleigh in April. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Oh." Owen said, "Yeah." She said, "Harold drove this every Sunday for 31 years. Owen said, "Every Sunday." She sat with the sound of the engine and the warmth coming up through the leather and said, "I understand." Caleb from the back seat said, "It's the best car." Owen didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. It was not a statement that required a response. It was a statement that required sitting with, in the particular warmth of an April afternoon, and an engine that had been dormant and was now running, and a car that had been through 4 years of a salvage yard, and 40 minutes of a mechanic who had learned to listen, and was now sitting in a parking lot in Raleigh with a 7-year-old, and a woman in a wool coat with silver hair, completing something that a railroad engineer in Asheville had set in motion before any of them knew it was moving. Closing, Owen drove home from Raleigh on the long road through Concord, the way Margaret had suggested, because she had grown up on it, and the hills were good that time of year. He took the back way north through Cabarrus County with the windows down in the April afternoon, and the silver shadow moving through the country in the quiet, unhurried way of a car that had always known where it was going. Caleb was asleep in the back seat by Concord. The way children slept in cars, completely, without reservations, with the full-body conviction of someone who had decided the moment was safe. Owen thought about Harold Sutton driving this road every Sunday. He thought about James Sutton in a back bedroom in Wilkes County with his archive boxes, building something that he couldn't see the outcome of but believed was worth building. He thought about Philip Arrowwood in a conference room with a document that had not existed in any archive for 160 years, saying the word that he didn't use casually. He thought about his father, who had spent 30 years in a corrugated metal building listening to what things were saying. He thought about Sarah, who had been 34 years old in a hospital in Charlotte on a February morning, and who had left him Caleb and the shop, and the particular quality of paying attention that grief teaches to people who decide, eventually, to learn from it rather than be defined by it. He thought about a woman with silver hair who had said "I understand" in the passenger seat of a car she had almost crushed, and who had meant it in the way people mean things when they have genuinely changed their mind rather than performed changing it. He thought about what his father had said. A machine that stops working has not died. It has told you something. Your job is to listen carefully enough to understand what it said. He had been hearing the same sentence applied to more than machines for 11 years. He thought it was probably one of the truest things anyone had ever told him, and that it applied to most of the things worth applying things to. The road went north through the hills. The engine ran. The afternoon light came through the windows at the angle of late April in the Piedmont, warm and specific, and not making any particular claims about what it was, just being what it was, which was enough. Some things went dormant and came back. Some things waited in attic boxes for the right hands. Some things were worth more than what they looked like from the outside, when you hadn't gotten underneath them yet, when you hadn't listened to what they were saying. Owen drove home through the hills with his son asleep in the back, and the engine saying what it had always been saying, clearly, to anyone willing to hear it. He was willing. He always had been.